Hi everyone, I'm Tally, this is Farrell and we're bored of it, and welcome to our preview of Restless, a 1 to 4 player narrative fantasy adventure game that is set across 3 acts, that is 3 game structure. The closest comparison would be something like Lands of Galzer, as in Restless. You'll also be wandering around different regions of a world map, having random encounters and following quest lines, except here, at the end of every game, you'll have an epic boss battle. And then at the end of the 3rd game, your story will be over. This is primarily a cooperative game with a competitive variation.
Exactly. So before we get into it, 2 things to know. First, this is a prototype that you're going to be seeing. So although actually we're very impressed by the level of production that is here, it is a prototype and some things are subject to change. We already know there'll be some improvement on the dice. Then the second thing is this is a paid preview. So please know that we were paid to create this coverage, but we had no input from the publisher, designer on what to include, what to say, anything like that. But just so you know. With that, we'll get into how to play.
You'll begin your mini campaign by being assigned one of the 4 characters, each of a different left field fantasy race, such as Shroomling or Merperson. Each one has a different player board and different attributes. Then you'll pick a city on the map, which you'll start in, and you're ready to adventure.
You'll start your turn by deciding if you want to move to a different region or stay in the region you're in. Once you've decided, you will then roll for an encounter using a D100, and then another player will read the relevant encounter in the relevant region from this massive book of adventures. You might end up being given a quest, you might have an exciting encounter with lots of options on how to proceed, or you might end up in combat against a monster. Alternatively, when you're in a region, you might have a quest, and quests are basically given to you by giving you a region name and a number. And you can say to the person who's reading the adventure book, hey, instead of rolling, I'm going to do quest 52, and they will read the relevant quest encounter in this adventure book.
After your encounter, you can trade with other players that are in your region, or you can buy gear from a shop if you're in a city. Gear goes onto your player board and gives you abilities and dice to roll during combat, but there are also other elements that can slot onto your player board, such as a profession or a pet, which can be useful outside of combat. Lastly, you'll always heal a little bit at the end of your turn, or you can heal a lot if you end your turn in a city. Each round, the first player will roll the die of doom, which will tell you how far to move down the doom track, which is essentially a timer for the session. Eventually, certain rolls will trigger a boss encounter, which is randomly drawn with the exception of the 3rd boss, which is always the same. Win or lose, this will signal the end of your game, and then you'll begin the next game where you left off in the story, your location, and with all of your stuff. Once you face the 3rd and final boss, you will reset, and then you can begin the 3-act campaign all over again.
Combat is straightforward because you're going to be given what dice you roll and what color of dice you roll by your player board or weapons if you have them. Once you roll them, you're then going to assign them to cards at the top of your player board, which have spaces for different colors and different values of dice, and you'll assign them to trigger the effects. So there's all different types. You could be healing yourself, you could be poisoning an enemy, you could be attacking an enemy straight for damage, and monsters work exactly the same. In a nice touch, the monsters are all contained within, in terms of how you run them, is all contained within the adventure book, within the encounter. So the other player who's reading your encounter will run the monster, and everything's there, so they don't have to faff about with getting out cards or boards or anything like that. They just use the book, which we really like. And the monsters work exactly the same way by rolling dice and assigning them to do different effects based on the monster. So in terms of how it plays out, you will get to roll your dice and the monster will roll all their dice at exactly the same time. And then you will often also have many abilities which will let you manipulate dice, either re-rolling some or modifying their value. And you'll kind of get to do that. You'll assign your dice, you'll trigger the effects, and then the monster will have their turn after that. And what's interesting is you can manipulate both your dice and your monster's dice usually. It's also important to note that you cannot die in this game. You will always be sent, if you lose combat, to the hospital, and then you kind of lose your next turn as you recover, but that's it. It means that there's no fail state in this game, except for losing against the final boss in the third game. Restless has a lot going for it, because it manages to hit that right spot over and over again. It begins by having a nice ease of entry and a low rules complexity, but it's also having just enough rules to make it interesting and give the players agency. Then things like the combat, which is a core part of it. Here you have a really simple system that's very, again, intuitive and easy to internalize, but there's just enough wiggle room in the system to mean that different players can approach it differently and different monsters feel distinct.
Something that I personally really like is the light touch when it comes to the narrative. So whilst there is a low level overarching story across the 3 games, the majority of what you're going to be doing is coming down to your random encounters and your quest lines. And these are just fun, very small snippets of story that don't necessarily relate to each other. So whilst this does mean that there's no real through line, this just really suits my personal taste, because I'm just not a fan of games with an overwhelming amount of story that just going on for dozens and dozens of sessions with no real end in sight. So the fact that these are little snippets just played across a 3-act campaign, you know when it's going to end, is just really perfect for me. Restless works particularly well for 2 players because the other person is required to read out of the Book of Adventures and manage the combat for the player whose turn it is. So both players are always engaged. The turns are quite quick, to be fair, so we don't think that there's a particular issue to play with more. It's just that 2 is a sweet spot for us. We also really like how, even though it is cooperative, players are mostly just bumbling about, doing their own thing, and then meeting up at the end to fight the final boss together. This means that players aren't sacrificing their own agency for the good of the group, although we can see how some people might not like this because of the lack of interaction.
Speaking of bumbling about, Restless is excellent in the way it handles exploration, because players are incentivized to explore, because every time you end your turn in a new region you haven't previously been to, you'll mark it off on your player sheet and get some experience, which allows you to level up. And in a very smart manner, as you level up, you're allowed to go to more regions, creating this feedback loop to keep players exploring. And it's particularly smart because what it does is it prevents players, because they always want to be on the move to level up, from sitting in one region and rinsing the encounters for that region, which would then lead to that region becoming stale, not only perhaps in that game, but in future games. The way it is, you might only roll for a small handful of events in one region across your 3-act structure. And this means there's a lot of replayability to Restless, because you will always be seeing something new for a lot of games because of the way exploration works.
When it comes to quests, we're in 2 minds about how these are handled. When you're given a quest, you will write down its encounter number on your notes along with the region and any rewards that you will get. On one hand, we like the ease and simplicity of this, but on the other hand, because there's so little information, when you go to do a quest, particularly if you gathered it in a previous session, it's very easy to forget what you were doing and what's going on and why you were originally given that quest in the first place.
In a similar manner, the Book of Adventures we're a little bit in 2 minds about. I do think it's really well done in terms of the design, the fun writing that's in here, the layout, the kind of referenceability, and also just the fact that it doubles as a map for combat. Really like all those elements. The only thing is, for something that you're using all the time in this game, it's just that tiny bit too fiddly for us to navigate, because rather than a lot of games do, which is splitting the encounters into kind of one big chunk, so 1 to 800, or splitting different regions into different booklets, which not quite 1-to-1, but kind of the thing that Vantage did. Here it's split into regions. And what that means is you have to find the region first, and then you have to find the encounter. And what we find is a lot of time, the person who's kind of navigating the book will often forget the number of the encounter because they're focused on finding the region, and then they have to go back. And it's just, that little bit extra. The second kind of part of that is this is a big book, and obviously you don't really want to be holding it like this, but because the front page and the back page are almost indistinguishable from any other page, it's like a little bit hard sometimes if you flip it like this to find the front page again, which makes it take longer for the next player who has to try and find the table of contents. And that might be a prototype thing. And then what this kind of means, especially because you might want to put it down in combat, is that every player has to kind of leave enough space next to them for this book to sit there. And this is very much personal preference, but we were really enamored by the way Lands of Galzir did it with their app-based integration of the storybook. But on that note, a lot of people won't like that. So it's one of these things where it's our opinion, but obviously you can never please everyone. From those smaller usability issues aside, Restless deserves a lot of praise for how excellent its production is. I mean, this is only a prototype, and there are some things that I know will be improved, and there's probably things I don't know about that will be improved. So I'm really excited to see what the final product is. And on a similar note, you know, this Book of Adventures, it's really a surprise to us as people getting a prototype that it is full of adventures, because usually in a game like this, you know, you'd be very limited in what you get in a prototype and where you go. So it goes to show how far along this game is and how much effort has gone into it. So with that, I think what we would like to highlight as our favorite piece of production is this dual layer player board. I think it's really a revelation in the way that it acts as a kind of gear loadout that you can socket your cards into. Because the first thing is it means different characters can have different loadout and be unique. And they can do that without needing to have rules references or check the rule book or anything like that, because you can just slot these cards in. Secondly, I think it's just a really nice and neat way to have your gear loadout in a game like this. And it's something that I haven't seen done before, and I am and do get pretty sick of like cards all over the table as you have your loadout in games like that. So I'm just really enamored with it, and I wish more games do it in the future.
This touches on another great element, the flexibility you get in how you play. When you buy a weapon, you'll also get a double-sided class card, which matches it, and you can choose either side. This basically dictates how you can use the dice that you roll during combat, giving you different builds. But before the first dice are rolled in each combat, you can choose to switch the side, and you can even choose to swap out the weapon entirely for another one. This allows players to easily experiment, trying different builds against different enemies, and to us, this is generally a pretty cool concept.
Final thoughts? Restless is a game that is in a position where it's attracting people who like a lighter, more free experience. You're not getting your rules overhead and gameplay complexity of, let's say, a Gloomhaven or something like that. It's not something you're getting if you want a long campaign and a lot of crunch. But what you are getting is a very nice time, a lot of kind of little snippets of story, a lot of wandering around and encountering things, and some nice mechanisms in terms of the combat and the way that exploration works and the way the world unfolds in front of you.
Yeah, 100% agree. Dare I say it, it's one of my favourites of this type of genre of game that I think we've played, for the reasons we talked about before, just the fact that there's not so much, heavy rules and story overhead. For me, this is more engaging, even though the story is a little bit random because it's not really a story. I find that type of thing a little bit more engaging than just having to remember everything that's already happened in a game, maybe like, I don't know, Sleeping Gods or something like that. But that's just maybe personal preference. I'm not a very imaginative person. I'm not someone that's excited by like deep stories. So I really, really enjoyed this. And like you said, I think the combat system's a particular highlight. It's a real satisfying puzzle to try and kind of flesh out what you're going to do with the dice that you've rolled. So if this sounds like something that's interesting to you, then I would recommend it as someone that's not typically a lover of these types of games, but really, really enjoyed this. Yeah,
I think it's a really nice, lower complexity, chill time as you just kind of go about and have adventures.
Yeah.
So I like both. I like the story-heavy games,
Yeah.
but I also like games like this because we're big fans of Lands of Gelder, which is probably the most similar comparison, although this has definitely more gameplay systems around it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I was also a fan, I think, not as much as you, but I think that is because I also lean towards the more, let's say, cohesive narrative elements. But there is so much about this I like, which I've already mentioned. So also recommend it if it sounds up your street, basically. Yeah, so that is our preview of Restless. We really appreciate you watching. Please ask any questions you might have, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.